So my name is Kristen Kidd, and I'm one of the coordinators with the Southeast Prevention Technology Transfer Center. And we're really excited to have all of you here today. I do want to point out that this training is 100% supported by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And what you're going to hear today doesn't necessarily represent the views, policies, and positions, nor is it necessarily endorsed by SAMHSA, HHS, or the U.S. government. So we really welcome and celebrate our diverse community of professionals, and the PTTC network as a whole really strives to create an inclusive atmosphere that respects the broad spectrum of identities and backgrounds of all of you. And inclusivity really begins with our language and the words that we choose to use and communicate. And to that end, the PTTC network uses affirming language to bring everyone into the conversation. So I'm sure this is old news for most of you. This is the PTTC network. There are 10 regional centers around the United States, and we each serve a certain number of states. We're in dark blue, the Southeast PTTC. We're housed at Wake Forest University School of Medicine. We serve 8 states here in the Southeast. And Leonard, if you could just check and make sure to mute people who aren't muted, that would be great. We provide free technical assistance and training to the substance misuse prevention workforce. If you have a TA request on our website, there's a little button on the main page where you can click and put in a request, and we'll follow up with you. If you don't live in the Southeast, don't worry. There is a regional center assigned to you, and they're there to provide free support, training, and technical assistance. So don't hesitate to reach out. So I know I'll get this question a number of times in the chat for the latecomers. Yes, this is being recorded, and it will be available on our YouTube channel in just a few days. Let's see, there are some resources that we're going to be sharing with you today in a Google Doc. So if for some reason you can't access Google, you can put a note in the chat, and Leonard will follow up with you. You have to put your email in the chat. But when you close out of this, you will automatically be sent to a site where you asked to complete the evaluation, also known as the GIPRA. When you complete that evaluation, don't rush out of it. Pause, because the certificate of attendance downloads automatically on your desktop. Usually it's in your downloads. So if you can't find it, go to your downloads, and that's where you would type in your name and save as onto your computer.
Thank you.
All right, let's see, we do have some people who aren't muted, and please do, thank you very much. So on our main page, which looks a little different than this image right now, is where you can sign up for our listserv. If you're not getting our monthly newsletter, please do sign up because you'll be kept abreast of all upcoming events, and I'm gonna share some of that in a minute. You can also go immediately to our YouTube page from the bottom of our website. And there's our website, pttcnetwork.org/Southeast. Upcoming events, we have quite a bit coming up. We're taking a break for spring break, but we're going to be back on April 10th talking about fostering community and campus collaborations. And we're going to be talking about prevention and harm reduction and recovery. So we're really trying to bust through those silos and bring everyone into an inclusive conversation. And then on April 23rd, this is really exciting. You don't want to miss this. We're going to be doing a collaborative summit with the Addiction Technology Transfer Center and the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, all here in the Southeast. So again, you don't have to live in the Southeast to come and get something out of it, but I encourage you to check out this webinar, because we're going to be talking about cultural intersections across the continuum of care. So do check that out. And then we've had a number of requests on grant writing. So we're doing a 3-part Lunch and Learn series. That's on May 20th, June 3rd, and June 10th. I encourage you to sign up for all 3 of those. If you really want to, if you don't know anything about grant writing, come. If you know something and you want to learn a little more, check out that series. All right, without further ado, we're going to move on into today's topic. And our presenter is Stephanie Strutner. She's a retired Substance Use Prevention Coalition Director. She also owns and operates an independent consulting firm, Catalyst Evaluation Group, where she provides support to clients through measuring impact, conducting biostatistical and epidemiological analyses. She also serves as a consultant and trainer for CADCA, where she teaches the intensive 3-week National Coalition Academy for the Office of National Drug Control Policy. She's also a trainer and consultant for the Alliance of Better Nonprofits in Knoxville, Tennessee, where she helps support local charities to operate using effective business models and evaluate effectiveness to achieve sustainability. She also serves as the part-time CEO for the Prevention Alliance of Tennessee. And with that, I'm going to stop my slides. And Stephanie, I will invite you to go ahead and share. I am going to put a Google link in the, oh, did it stop or did it start up? No, it didn't. It's okay.
Thank you, Kristen, and hello, everyone. It's nice to see you today. I feel like we've been together a lot on talking about communications, this being our 3rd session. So I recognize many of you. It looks like most of you have been with us for the previous 2 sessions, but if not, it's okay. You'll be able to pick up right where we begin today. But we will be building on some of our conversations that we started on in previous sessions. So we talked about in previous sessions about our avatar, and the avatar being the target of, or the area, the person of focus with whom we're working with in our communities. And so when we think about that avatar, we're really thinking about the group, or in some instances, if you've received prevention training before, you might think about these as sector representatives. And so we're really thinking about more specific than the sector representative, the actual person with whom we're trying to reach. And so when we dive into our communication strategies and our communication plans for today, we're really thinking about specifically how do we reach those people. Our conversations in session 1 and session 2 surrounded around this idea of if you've ever been on social media, or you've ever been in a faith community, or you've ever been anywhere before where you were part of a large group, but you felt like the person who was speaking directly to you, and their message really resonated with you, it's because they had done some investigation into their avatar. So that is what we want to do. We want to be effective in our communications so that when we reach out to the community, whether it be through mass media or individual media, we want to make sure that the people whom we are trying to reach feel that from us, and they feel that it is a very personal message. And so in order for us to make sure that that happens, we have to be very strategic and intentional about the messages that we package. And so today we're going to talk about those interpersonal and group communication techniques. We're going to talk about how our coalitions can plan for effective communication across our strategic plans. And then finally, we'll give you an opportunity to tie all 3 of these sessions together to develop a communication plan that will be effective for your work through your organization. So let's first dive into our first objective for today, which is our 6th objective for our time together, thinking about interpersonal and group communication techniques. Obviously, we live in both of these worlds very frequently. So our group communication is very regular. If we're part of a coalition or a large organization that's community serving, there are a lot of times where we're working in a group setting. In that group setting is where technically it's defined as exchanging ideas among 3 or more people. So we can be involving a large number of people here. The group communication channel is going to be a little bit more formal and a little bit more structured. That's kind of required of group communication because we've got to make sure that there is some sort of order so that when we come into a room, we actually get something done, that people are able to communicate effectively with one another, and we're able to achieve our goal. We also, in group communication, involve teams. There's a lot of collaboration. So there will be subcommittees or small groups that are working together that are part of a larger group that help us to achieve our mission or get our task accomplished. Group communication also focuses on achieving a common goal. So we're coming together to either problem solve or make decisions or engage in strategic planning so that we can achieve the goal that we all share. So when we think about the group communication, we're really thinking about meetings or maybe even conferences, group dialogue. Our Zoom meeting today could be a form of group communication. On the flip side, we also have interpersonal communication, and interpersonal communication is really just that exchange of ideas or information between two or just a few people. We're limited in our interpersonal communication to a very small number of people. It's a lot more intimate and it's more personal. And so when we think about that interpersonal communication, we wouldn't necessarily, in a group setting where we have 30 or 40 people, ask everybody how their family members are doing or ask them how their weekend was. But when we have interpersonal communication, we're connecting on more of that personal level. So we do ask those more personal questions because we're building relationships. The interpersonal communication is direct and it's immediate. And so what that means is, by immediate, is we get nonverbal cues. We get that feedback from them right away when that's happening. Interpersonal communication gives us an opportunity for a deep understanding of specific issues, because if we're just having a one-on-one conversation, then it is natural and expected for people to ask probing questions. And so it would be more like two-way communication, two-way dialogue if we have that interpersonal communication. We're also, in that interpersonal space, focused on building and maintaining relationships. Obviously, everything we do in our work is focused on building relationships. We always talk about, in the capacity space, building capacity to build and maintain relationships. But in the interpersonal space, it's even more critical. This is where we have the opportunity to really focus on the individual and identify what ties them to our work. How can we be effective in reaching out to that individual and making sure that where we're plugging them in and the way that we're communicating with them and the way that we're identifying avenues for their participation is appropriate for them. So it's very personal. Interpersonal communication can be face-to-face conversations. It can be conversations on the phone, or maybe even text messaging with one another. Any form of direct communication is going to fall into this realm. So when we think about the type of group that we're reaching, then we're able to think about how best we can facilitate these groups. And facilitation is really a learned skill. You've probably been somewhere that you had a facilitator that facilitated the event very well, and you might have taken note, or it might have just been so expected that they do a good job you didn't even notice all of the little things they were doing in the background to make sure the facilitation went off well without a hitch. But you've probably also been somewhere where there was someone who was facilitating who didn't have as strong a skill set in group facilitation, where maybe there was a lot of background noise, or there was a group of people in the room who were talking loudly and it was disrupting the group. Maybe you were in a group training and the room was just absolutely freezing or really, really hot, or there was some sort of distraction out in the hallway. Sometimes I notice, because I'm a facilitator, if you're in a big conference center and there's a lot of noise out in the hallway, the facilitator will just nonchalantly walk over to the door and close the door and not allow it to interrupt the training or the group session. And so these are the types of techniques that become important, as well as some of those baseline ideas of establishing a welcoming and positive environment. This is something that's very important to solidify from the very moment that you start a meeting, a training, any type of facilitated session. We want to make sure that we kick it off on the right foot and that it's a positive environment and people feel welcome and they feel like they should be there. I think a lot of times adults especially kind of roll their eyes and cringe when they think about icebreakers, but icebreakers don't have to be the traditional old icebreakers that some people really dislike. If you have a room full of extroverts, chances are they're going to appreciate some sort of icebreaker. But if you have a room full of introverts, chances are they're really going to dislike the idea of an icebreaker. And so the goal of a strong facilitator is to make sure that you have some sort of warm-up activity that is going to be tolerated well by both your introverts and your extroverts in the room, so that they can build a connection and kind of ease into the purpose of why you're together. And so as you're coming up with icebreakers, we don't want to just use the icebreaker that's fun or nice for us, but we want to think about our population and our audience and make sure we come up with something that's going to be appreciated by the people who are in our group. And so when we are facilitating a group, we want to have a structured agenda. On that agenda, we want to make sure that we're ensuring alignment with all of the group's goals. We want to, at times, make sure we have a timeline and that we're sticking to a timeline. Especially, there are times where we have days where we have to get a whole lot done and we have a short amount of time to do it. And we can have some people who come in that just totally derail the conversation. And so we need to, as facilitators, have the ability and the confidence to rein the group back in if we get off topic or off task. That's why sometimes it's really good to have those times and the timelines associated on our agenda. One thing that I did as a coalition director was, there was a member of our coalition who wasn't necessarily very outspoken, but she really wanted to make sure that everybody stayed on task. And so we just assigned her to be the official timekeeper. So if we got derailed on an issue, she would say, "Excuse me," to whoever the chair was, "we're a little over time on this area," and it helped everybody acknowledge that we needed to be respectful of the group and stick to that timeline. When we're facilitating, we also want to engage in active listening. It's important that we validate the input that people are putting forward. And I had a conversation recently with a colleague, and we were facilitating a large group, and there was another facilitator with us. And when they would ask a question and people would offer answers to the questions, they would just say, "Mm-hmm," and move on. So what that showed us and what we talked about is that facilitator really wasn't engaging with the audience. They weren't actively listening, because had they been actively listening, they could have followed up with, "I really appreciated what you said about," whatever, make some point about something that person said, or ask a follow-up or probing question about one of the points that they made. And so that's one really important way that we can validate the input that people put forward when they're providing input in the session that we're facilitating. And so I'll say that this is not something that was innate to me when I became a facilitator. Rather, it's been something that I've had to practice and refine through the years. So I encourage you, as you're facilitating groups, to really push pause before you ask a question, and remind yourself, be an active listener right now. And sometimes that means taking notes on what people say so that you can circle back around and make some sort of validating comment or follow-up question to their input. It's also really important to encourage participation from everyone. We want to have balanced participation in the room. We don't just want to hear from the loudest voices or the people who are most confident in the room. We want to set up a system so that everybody who's there, whether they are the quietest person in the room or the loudest person in the room, feels like their input is heard and that they have an opportunity to speak. And so a facilitator will have different techniques of how we, in adult education, we don't really want to just call on people. If I were to right now just say, "Hey, David Sherman," and I see David's nonverbals right now. I intentionally pick somebody with their camera on, because if I just call on somebody and ask them a question, it really puts us on the spot. And, maybe we don't want to be called on. So in adult education, it's really not a best practice to call specifically on someone. However, in a group facilitation opportunity, we want to be able to give people the opportunity to volunteer to speak, but then we also, as we're minding the room and as we're getting to know the personalities that are present, we might want to find ways that we can call on people who haven't had the opportunity to speak. And one way to do that, rather than calling on somebody by name, like I just did to David, who was a very good sport about it, by the way, is to say something like, let's hear from someone that we haven't heard from yet today, someone who hasn't yet spoken. And so that's a great way for people who have had a lot of input already to say, okay, maybe it's time for me to be quiet. And sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. But as a facilitator, we'll come up with our own techniques to make sure that we have that balanced participation. We also, at times, have to find ways to manage group dynamics and address conflict and those dominant personalities. This is something that requires us to be pretty dynamic and also very emotionally intelligent. Because if we have a dominant personality or if we have conflict that arises, it really gives us the responsibility, I would say, to make sure that we're keeping order for the rest of the group. And so being that facilitator requires us to make sure that we are managing that dynamic. And sometimes when I think about those dominant personalities that come in, sometimes that's just having a side conversation to say, hey, when you give an opinion, why don't you ask somebody else in the room what they think? And that's one way to help manage some of those dominant personalities. Another way is to let them be heard, but also we could ask people to raise their hands before they speak so that we can call on people. That way the person, that dominant personality who always has something to say every single time, they'll raise their hand every single time, but we don't have to call on them first every single time. Another way to give us the opportunity to balance participation. I'll talk a little bit more about managing group dynamics, and so I'll leave that there for now. But really one of the biggest responsibilities we have as a facilitator is to foster collaboration. And so thinking about what our goal at hand is, we want to think about how we can pull everybody in the room into being part of reaching that goal. And so how do we do that? Well, for one thing, we want to make sure that we're mindful of the goal at hand and that we don't allow anything to get derailed, but that also we have some sort of mechanism or multiple mechanisms for how we make sure that every single person in the room by the end of the period has had adequate opportunity to speak or let their voices be heard. And sometimes it's not even about speaking. One of my favorite techniques in a facilitation setting is to use post-it notes and give people the opportunity to write down their ideas on post-it notes, and then they can walk up and stick the post-it notes in different areas on chart paper or on a sticky wall or on a whiteboard. And that way, whether they're a quiet person or a loud person, they still have the opportunity for their idea to go up and be posted in front of the group. It gives us an opportunity to really think about that collaboration. Nobody wants to come to a meeting that they think is going to be a collaborative meeting and just be talked to the whole time. And so we have to figure out structured ways to give people the opportunity to be part of that discussion and to be part of that collaboration. I've mentioned this before, but the idea of planning for planning used to just tickle me to death. I thought it was so ridiculous and really an oxymoron. But planning for planning, when I started working in the coalition sector, I understood exactly what it meant, because it takes more time for us to plan for a collaborative meeting than it does for us to plan for a one-way meeting. So if we put time into planning for planning, it gives us the opportunity to really create that sense of collaboration and create that space where people can come and be part of the solution. And the thing about it is, if people come and they're part of the solution, they feel like they are part of the process, and it's going to help us build capacity. At the end of the day, we're constantly trying to make sure that we have enough capacity to do the work of our organization. And so that becomes very critical. Another thing to consider are the different styles of learning that we have in a room or in a group. And so we're going to have, and we'll expand upon this just a little bit on the next slide, but this gives us a visual. And so some people are visual learners. So they're going to learn by seeing this diagram best. Some people are logical learners. We have verbal learners, we have oral learners, we have physical learners. And then there are people who learn best in solitary settings, and there are other people who learn best in social settings. These are called the mimetic styles of learning. What's important for us is that we acknowledge that everybody learns in a different way. And so we want to balance our training approach to make sure that we give people the opportunity to learn in multiple different ways. So when we think about those visual or spatial learners, if you're a visual learner or a spatial learner, you prefer using pictures or images to engage in your learning. If you're an oral or an auditory learner, you prefer learning through sound. So a lecture for you would be a really great learning tool. If you're a verbal or linguistic learner, you prefer using words like speech or writing. So you would learn best in either a lecture or reading a textbook. If you're a physical learner or a kinesthetic learner, you prefer learning by doing, using your body, having that sense of touch. If you're a logical or mathematical learner, you prefer using logic or reasoning, understand the logic behind why something needs to be or why something is happening. And then the other two domains are separate. So you would be one of the previous styles and either social or solitary, where you are either an interpersonal learner where you learn best in a group, or you're a solitary learner where you're intrapersonal and you prefer to work alone using self-study. So thinking about these styles of learning, and I'll leave the definitions up for you, but I'll go back just so you can have another view of the styles of learning. And most of us are also a combination of a number of different styles of learning. So if you had to identify your top 2 styles of learning, and I'll ask you to turn to the chat box for this, what 2 styles of learning would you most identify with being your strongest area of learning? I'll kick it off by saying I would be very much visual and kinesthetic or physical.
Lots of visual, logic, physical, visual, logical, some kinesthetic, kind of run the gamut.
Yeah, and that's really the point. So thank you all for helping us to identify. But one of the reasons that it's important to identify your own personal style of learning is we are most equipped, and I always think of the love languages. If you've ever gone through that study of the languages of love, there's also languages of apology. There are work languages. So if you've ever done one of those, you will know that we are most likely to reciprocate in our own language. So we most often reciprocate styles of learning or teach in styles of learning that are like the ones that we prefer to learn. And so it's really good to understand your preferred method because if you prefer if you understand your preferred learning style, then it's easier for us to build the other learning styles around our preferred style, which gives us the opportunity to have that balanced style of learning across the board. So as you're thinking about facilitating, as you're thinking about working with groups, we want to build in as many of these styles of learning as possible over the course of your session. And so let's think about some facilitation techniques, and we'll start with the interpersonal. So thinking about that one-on-one, building rapport and trust in a supportive environment. It is important, and I go back to Jody made a comment when I was talking about calling on adults to give answers, saying that it would be a non-trauma informed way to go about learning. And Jody is absolutely right. It is not necessarily a way for us to build rapport with people. It's also not necessarily a good way for us to create a supportive environment for people who don't appreciate being called on like that. And so the ways that we facilitate are interpreted by the people in the group, and they're going to respond in their own way. Also, having an opportunity to actively listen and provide active feedback is important as a facilitator. I mentioned before the importance of active listening and providing that active feedback. So another way of actively listening and showing that active feedback and validating people's responses is using chart paper. So when people are brainstorming in a room, if we write down their response, that validates their response. That shows active feedback that we're listening and engaging to what they're doing. There are lots of ways that we can go about this. In interpersonal communication, we also want to be very clear and concise. We don't want to talk all the way around a topic and not get to the point. We want to get to the point and be very clear in how we do that. We also want to encourage open dialogue. And if we are, especially a lot of times when we facilitate, we're brainstorming or strategic planning. And so we want to give people the opportunity to have some open dialogue. The benefit of this is if people are brainstorming ideas out loud, it gives other people the mental space to be able to think and add on to those ideas, and it sparks new ideas. The downside is we can have people who, a lot of times when people are brainstorming out loud, thinking out loud, they can kind of just ramble on a bit. And so as the facilitator, we have to find a nice little space where we give people the opportunity to engage in open dialogue, but we try to monitor and reduce the amount of rambling or talking in circles that sometimes people do. It's also important to use nonverbal communication effectively. And so one of the easiest ways to think about of how facilitators use nonverbals is the example I used earlier. If we have a table in the back that's talking loudly over some other people who are speaking in the room, we could just walk to that part of the room and stand there, and oftentimes that will make the people acknowledge that they're causing a disruption in the room. That's one way to use nonverbal communication effectively. Showing empathy and understanding. So if people are talking about, and a lot of times in what we do in substance use prevention or behavioral health, we are talking about really hard topics. They're trauma provoking for some people. They're emotional for other people. And so we want to be able to show that empathy and show understanding. Kristen kicked us off today by talking about the importance of inclusivity in language. And that's one way that we can show empathy and show understanding. But then also, when I'm facilitating, especially with a group of people who don't always or haven't always worked in our field, they may not know. And so I think, as Kristen kicked us off today, it's great to acknowledge that we are creating a space of inclusivity, and here are some tangible ways that we do that. And giving people, acknowledging that we're in a safe space. So if I say something as a facilitator, I hope that you will find a way to let me know. So, because we're all continuously learning. And so by acknowledging that and showing that as the facilitator, I care about how people feel in this space, then it gives people other people a safe space to where if they are not using inclusive language, we can find a way to either be subtle or caring and let them know how they can be more affirming in their language. Addressing and resolving conflict is also important. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And then being flexible and adaptable to feedback. Because even we come in with the best of intentions as facilitators, doesn't mean we're perfect. And we might have to change our course of action coming into a day. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that we fail as a facilitator. It just means that we're adaptable to the group, which can be really important. Applying emotional intelligence is also critical here. In order to be an effective facilitator, we have to be emotionally intelligent enough to read people's emotions and their nonverbals. And sometimes people are really good at this, and other times this is a learned behavior. For me, I have taken several classes on emotional intelligence that have been very helpful in giving me the opportunity to be a better facilitator, a stronger facilitator. And so if that's you, there are some good classes out there on emotional intelligence that give us the opportunity to understand about the group dynamic, to understand about how to read people's nonverbals, about how to read the inflection in people's voices, and about how to understand and apply emotional intelligence. Another good technique in facilitation is setting boundaries, and this is best achieved at the beginning. And I really, especially with adults, prefer to let the group set their own boundaries. Because if we give people the opportunity to set their own boundaries, just as we do in strategic planning and action planning, when people come up with their own ideas, they're more likely to follow through with them. And same with setting boundaries. If the boundaries are of the group is going to be more likely to follow and adhere to those boundaries. A lot of times when we think about boundaries, the first things that come to mind is somebody will say, turn the ringer off on your cell phone, or don't type during the meeting, or if someone is speaking, don't speak over them. And these are good boundaries to have in a group meeting, and it's also a best practice to let your group come up with those boundaries themselves. I want to dive into emotional intelligence just a bit. This is certainly not a deep dive, but just a surface level conversation about emotional intelligence. So there are 5 different areas that define emotional intelligence. And first is self-awareness. And self-awareness, I think, sometimes might be one of the most difficult areas of emotional intelligence. It's easy for us to pick up on what other people are doing, and sometimes it's not as easy for us to identify our own areas of strengths and weaknesses when it comes to emotional intelligence. So self-awareness is key, because if we are self-aware of our own emotions and our own behaviors, then it gives us the opportunity to show more empathy to other people. When other people are expressing emotion, then we must identify when the time is appropriate to show that empathy and how we show empathy in that situation. Motivation is also an important part of emotional intelligence, and the motivation being why someone is feeling this way and why they would be contributing to our conversation we're facilitating. What's their motivation behind it? And being able to understand that motivation is an important driver from a facilitation standpoint, because it helps us to ask the right questions to get people on the right track to help the group collaborate and achieve our goals. Self-regulation is certainly a more advanced component of emotional intelligence, but that self-regulation gives us the ability to do just that, to be able to regulate ourselves in an environment, even when we might be triggered, or if we're facilitating a group and someone says something that is offensive, then we have to immediately jump into that self-regulation mode so that we have the ability to make sure that we save face for the person who said something inappropriate, but that we also protect the rest of the people who are in the group who potentially may be triggered by what they said. And then finally, social skills, that piece of emotional intelligence that helps us to tie all of the other components together, is not only being aware of our own self and being aware of other people, but then being able to weave that connection between all of the areas of emotional intelligence so that we can all move forward in a very healthy place with healthy boundaries together as a group. Let me pause here on emotional intelligence, and please feel free to unmute, or you may also enter into dialogue in the chat. Has anybody ever done any studies or courses on emotional intelligence? And if so, how did that help you in your work?
I will say for me, I haven't done any courses, but I did read a book on it, focused on building emotional intelligence. Think as a parent, I was interested in it.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it helped me be a better parent and think about better ways to engage my children and raise them.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Kristen.
Yeah, you guys are welcome to unmute. You can unmute yourselves if you'd like, or you can put something in the chat. I don't see anything in the chat yet.
I'll say from my perspective, and I think that emotional intelligence can be something that's difficult to talk about because we acknowledge our own faults when we talk about emotional intelligence. But for me, I came to a realization, and I was an adult when this happened, is understanding that I have a very strong personality and I can come across as being intimidating to other people. And it took me a while to understand that it's because I come from a place of confidence, but I'm also very goal oriented. So I am more focused on the task at hand rather than the people's emotions that come into it. And so as an adult, having that understanding about myself has helped me to be more self-aware so that I can really pull in and be more empathetic to help work with other people, especially people who might be really turned off by somebody who presents with such a strong personality. And then Kristen, they're asking about the name of the book in the chat, if you can pop that in there, if you remember.
I'll look on the shelves behind me because it might still be there. Jody made an interesting comment that Jody's taken a lot of courses and read numerous books because in a family of engineers, there's a dearth of emotional intelligence. Yeah, it was Daniel Goleman, Emotional Intelligence. Thanks, Jody.
Yeah, I have been trying to help my husband who has a EI of about, it's in single digits, I'm pretty sure. And my children, I have two mechanical engineers, a son and a daughter, and a second son has applied mathematics. And so, yeah, it's, they all have a range of emotional intelligence. But I would say it's particularly challenging when people don't understand how, like if they just ramble on and they don't look at their audience and see that their audience is like, la la, how do I get out of this, please? And so just helping them understand, like, to do things like look at people, look where they're looking, maybe consider what you're saying, and is it important, and are you the person to deliver that message at this time? So
yeah, thank you, Jody. That's a really, really good point. I know it, and especially transitioning to the virtual learning space where we used to have so many of these sessions, like today, a training event. You know, if we look back 5 years, we weren't doing this online necessarily, very rarely, if ever. I think maybe 4 times a year I might engage in some sort of virtual meeting or virtual learning session. And so it became very different. And one of the ways that we can engage in emotional intelligence and that self-awareness in the virtual space and reading people's behaviors, like you're saying, are through nonverbals. And so oftentimes in the Zoom space or in the WebEx or virtual space, I'll ask people to turn their cameras on. And it is in no way trying to monitor you or your behavior or your participation. Rather, it's helping me to be a better facilitator. Because like you say, if you're the facilitator and you're not reading the room to see if people are tracking along with you nonverbally, or if people are just giving you a dazed look, then we might need to go back and revisit that topic. Or maybe we need a stretch break, or maybe we need some sort of activity to build in. And so there are a lot of ways that we can, as the facilitator, engage in those kinds of discussions as well. So when we think about being an effective facilitator, we want to make sure that we're understanding the goals. We don't just go into a room and start a conversation. Rather, we have a goal. There is a tangible goal of our time together, and then we want to have an agenda that ties to that. So the agenda is our step-by-step of how we're going to achieve that goal. And if we keep to our agenda, then we're more likely going to be able to achieve our goal. And if we achieve our goal time after time, people are going to keep coming back to groups that you're facilitating. And that's the whole point. We want to be able to sustain our work. In order to sustain our work, we have to have the capacity to do so. And so making sure that we're keeping to the agenda so that we achieve the goal is really important. We also want to make sure, and I mentioned this, to make sure that we involve and engage all of the participants. And sometimes what this means, and I often use the term calling an audible, and it's a sports reference, but sometimes we have the best laid plans, and we have an agenda and a plan that we walk into a facilitated group, and we get there and we realize the plan that we put together is not going to work with the dynamic of people that we have in the room. And this happened to me last Sunday. In fact, we had a team of 3 facilitators, and we had a very clear, well planned out idea of how we were going to go in and facilitate this group. And when we got there, before the meeting even started, we knew that our plan was not going to work. And so we called an audible. And in order for us to engage every participant, we had to shift what was going to be a group discussion into small group work. And that was okay. But I think part of being an effective facilitator is also being dynamic and flexible enough to cater to the needs of your group. So the task at hand is more important than my personal agenda that I come in with. And then facilitating decisions in a democratic process is important, because we don't just want, we talked about this earlier, we don't just want the loudest voice in the room to get their way every time. Rather, we want to go with a democratic process, meaning we want to vote with the majority. We want to plan the process. Effective facilitators establish an effective climate, and they consider logistics and room arrangements. So before we set up a meeting, do we need a U-shaped table arrangement, or do we need round tables where people are going to sit in small discussions? Do we need a theater style classroom, or do we need space where people can get up and walk around? These are all important concepts that we consider when we're the facilitator. We talked about setting ground rules. Some common ground rules are one person speaking at a time, raising your hand to be acknowledged, listening to other people, not mocking or attacking other people when they speak, being on time, starting and ending on time, respecting each other, limiting cell phone use. But again, I really prefer to let the group set their own ground rules. It typically comes up with a list that's pretty comprehensive like this, but people have a little bit more buy-in because we're not telling them what to do. And adults especially don't like to be told what to do. We want to make sure that we plan our meetings and that we give people something to do when they come, because literally nobody, and I might have mentioned this before, but this is kind of one of my soapboxes, and Kristen, I think, concurs. Nobody wants to come to your meeting that could have been an email. I could literally wallpaper my entire office with blue ribbons if I had received one every time I attended a meeting that could have been an email. So if you're just reading me a review or a recap of what you've done in the last month, please don't invite me to your meeting. Send me an email because I don't have time for that. If I'm coming to your meeting, I want to be there to be part of a solution. We want to be able to plan forward. And so don't be that person who creates an agenda and you just go and you read your agenda to people. Because everybody there, just about everybody there can read it on their own. So think about how we plan in advance and plan comprehensively so that we can create an effective meeting. And again, what this means is more work time for us on the front end, but less follow-up work time on the back end. It gives people the opportunity to be part of the process. All right, enough about that. So I told you we'd talk about conflict management. And when it comes to conflict, there are a couple different ways to think about this. So this is a more streamlined approach. This is a more interpersonal approach, but we'll walk through both of these. So on the left, you see the words going up and down. Maintaining the relationship is not important. So we might be more competing or avoiding if the relationship is not important. Whereas on the right side, the relationship is really important. So we might be more collaborating or more accommodating. And at the top, when my needs are most important, we might compete or collaborate. Where at the bottom, if your needs are less important than the relationship, we might avoid or be more accommodating. But you see the fox there in the middle. And in coalition work, that's really where we find ourselves because the relationships are important. The task is important. And so we have to find that sweet spot in the middle where we're maintaining our relationships, but we're also achieving the task at hand. So a lot of us find ourselves in that compromising space, but there are instances where we move into different areas based on the situation at hand. This is another way to think about conflict management. It's the same theory, it's just a different learning styles. And so if we have a high level of assertiveness, we might be more competing or collaborating. Where if the task at hand is really important, then we're going to collaborate, and the relationship is important, we're going to collaborate. If the relationship is less important, but the task is more important, then we might be more competing. But again, we see that compromise, that sweet spot in the middle. And that's usually where most of us find ourselves in our work because both the task and the relationship are important. Any questions about conflict management or interpersonal communication before we move on?
Yes. How do you go to these? Sometimes I've gone to meetings where it was a great meeting and someone got upset with something someone in the room may have said or the facilitator may have said, and then they burst out crying, said that they were intimidated and all of that. How do you deal with, I ain't gonna say a Karen, but how do you deal with a person that has that many emotions?
Well, Angela, thank you for your question. I think that's a really important question. I think that's something that many of us have seen happen in meetings or facilitated sessions where we've been. And I think that it's a multifold approach to how we address this and prevent it. So I think, all of us are here because we believe in prevention. So I do believe that prevention is worth a pound of cure in this case. And if we create an environment in which we demand respect, then we can hopefully prevent that from happening. But we're not going to prevent that from happening 100% of the time. So there are going to be times where somebody is bound to get their feelings hurt. And when that happens, I think what I have generally done in my experience is to go directly to that person and try to have a one-on-one to understand where they're coming from. And then if we have a situation where somebody said something that was really offensive that I learned in that one-on-one, I would go one-on-one with that other individual and have a conversation with them as well. This is real life. I have done this a number of times before. And I think that there are just a lot of personalities that come into play in group dynamics. And people don't say things to intentionally hurt people all the time. But even when it's an accident, it's something that needs to be addressed. And I think sometimes people say offensive things when they are coming from a place of privilege and they don't understand the lived experience of someone else. And so just being able to give someone the platform to be able to share their lived experience has softened me. I've seen it soften other people who have said offensive things in group settings. I prefer not, unless it is something that is just absolutely egregious, I prefer to address it one-on-one rather than in a group setting, because if we go back, my value on the relationship is high. So I want to find myself in that collaborating space, but then sometimes we've got to be accommodating because the relationships of all the people and moving to the task is important as well. And so being able to find that space. But I also think that we can really prevent some of these things from happening by the way that we set up the dynamic of our meetings and the expectations of our meetings. Does that help? Good. Thank you for bringing that up. Any other questions or comments? Well, let's dive into how we can plan for effective communication across our strategic plan. Obviously, we are following the strategic prevention framework. We're focusing on relationships often in building capacity, but when we get to that planning area, we want to make sure that we are focused on how we communicate effectively across all the sectors in our communities in the way that is best achieved for that individual. So it's not necessarily communicating to a sector, but it's rather communicating to all of the individuals within that sector. And so how can we be effective in that? Well, first of all, when we think about in the assessment phase, we've got to make sure that all of our volunteers and all of our members understand the reason that we need a community assessment. If we're clear about deadlines, if we're beginning to establish relationships here, we can be very effective in how we communicate to people across the assessment phase of the strategic prevention framework. And then we want to be very clear in how the community can understand the document that we put together. And so thinking about the community assessment in all of your communities, I see Naomi there, and Naomi's community assessment is going to cater to Naomi's community. And Naomi's community assessment is going to look different from Angela's community assessment. And Angela's community assessment is going to look different from Allie's community assessment, because we're all serving different communities. And our community assessments and all of the documents that we create and prepare need to be specific to our population of focus, and it needs to be easily understood by our population of focus. So one of the things that is important is to make sure that our population of focus is involved in putting it together, because if they put it together, it's going to be more uniquely defined for that population. Communicating effectively as it relates to capacity means expressing that mutual benefit. This is critical because what's in it for the person that we're recruiting to be part of our work? And then what level of commitment is going to be expected of them? We don't want to just arbitrarily say, hey, can you come join our coalition? Because what does that even mean? I mean, does that mean an hour a week? Does it mean 5 hours a week? Does it mean 2 hours a month or 20 hours a month? We need to have clear expectations and job descriptions so that people know what they're getting into. They're more likely to say yes if you're very clear about communicating to them what the expectations are. When it comes to planning, we want to engage our members. We've talked a lot about that, but allow members to bring a friend. This is a great way to help to spread the word and communicate about what we're doing and let the community have a say in that planning. Identifying those mutually beneficial strategies are really important, especially when we have lots of other social service agencies that are coming in to help us with our planning. Making sure that we have strategies that are beneficial for multiple parties involved are going to make us most successful. And then communicating our data is critical as well. Also helps us to get data when we communicate those data and we share it with other partners. When it comes to implementation, we want to make sure that we are clear about our expectations, that we identify the work to be done, and that tasks are responsibly delegated in advance. This goes back to planning and engaging our members in our planning. When they're engaged in the planning, they're more likely to say, oh yeah, I can help with that when it comes time to execution. It helps us to spread that workload and gives us avenues for reporting, because we have a whole lot of people doing a little bit of work that adds up to a lot. And then effectively training our volunteers, communicating to them what needs to be done and giving them the tools that they need to be able to implement it is important. Communicating through our evaluation is also critical, and not just evaluating our work, but sharing the evaluation, communicating those quarterly reports or the short-term, the intermediate, the long-term impact reports that we have, and communicating those to the community in a way that's understandable is important. Obviously, cultural competence is critical, and understanding the cultures that exist in our community is important. When we communicate, we want to make sure that we're sharing with people in their native language and their preferred method of communication. Is it email? Is it a newsletter, newspaper? Is it social media? Whatever it is, we need to make sure that we're prepared to communicate in that method. We also want to give people the opportunity to share their cultural practices with the coalition, because it's two-way communication here. And we mentioned this, but we want to fully engage persons with lived experience. Nobody wants us to plan for them. Our goal is to plan with one another. And I see two hands up. I see Jody and Kristen. I'm not sure which one popped up first. Kristen, do you know?
I was going to say, Jody has her hand up.
Okay, what's up, Jody?
Oh, I just forgot to take it down from before. My apologies.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Thank you for engaging with us. Another way that we can communicate is identifying social drivers of health in our communities and coming up with strategies we can use to overcome barriers to those social drivers. We are seeing a lot of coalitions now having specific strategies in their action plan to address those social drivers of health. And I think that's where our field is going to be moving over the next few years. We communicate about sustainability often, the need for sustainability, how we incorporate strategies into our existing infrastructure to make sure we sustain our work, sharing our annual operating budget with the community and making sure that we raise enough money to meet that annual operating budget each year help to lead us to sustainability. So these are just some examples of how we engage in communication across the strategic prevention framework. But now thinking about those strategies, how do we create a communication plan that gives us an opportunity to be very strategic in our communications work? Well, first of all, our communication plan needs to identify the what, the who, the when, the where, and the how. So the benefits to having a communication plan that is as comprehensive as this are making sure that we clarify our goals and objectives, that we are identifying the relationship between our audience, the message, the channels. Remember in the first session, we talked about the messages that I, the encoder, create, and I send it through a channel to the decoder, which is my population of focus, and then they translate that message, and then they give some sort of feedback, hopefully. So we have to figure out the relationship between these communication channels in our communities and our population of focus. And then we want to implement a variety of communication activities to make sure that we reach every person who's part of our population of focus in the way that they best are going to receive our communication. Think about driving down the highway and seeing a billboard. There are billboards that are meant for you, and there are billboards that are meant for other people. The billboards that are meant for you are going to catch your eye, and you're going to see it and you're going to read it. And all of the other stuff is just noise in the community. So if you're scrolling on social media, sometimes you're going to pause and you're really going to hone in on something. That's what we want to do, is we want to have that hook so that when we identify a member of our population of focus in the community, they take pause and they see our message. So in order for us to do this, we want to be creative in how we're coming together with our communication solutions. This means collaborating with our partners. It means incorporating stakeholder input, and it means evaluating what we're doing to make sure that we're on the right track. So how do you create your communication plan? Well, first, you want to audit your existing materials. Go back through all of the materials your coalition has put together and identify who the population of focus is, and if you have done a good job making sure that you're reaching that population of focus with the message that they need to hear. Setting SMART goals, identifying your avatar. This goes back to the first session about very specifically, who are you trying to reach? What are they wearing? Where are they shopping? What are they doing at 3 p.m. in the afternoon? Including your avatar in your planning and figuring out what's the cadence and the timeline of when you submit your communication materials. Assigning roles to team members to make sure that one person doesn't have to carry the burden of the entire communication plan, and then documenting it so that we can evaluate it and come back later and see if it worked. Because if it did, great, we'll give ourselves a big pat on the back and then we'll repeat it again next time. But if it didn't work, we're going to go back and revise it to make sure that we do better next time. So I'd like for you now to take a few moments. Leonard put in the chat box, but I'm going to put it in there again, the link to the Google document. This Google document, you won't be able to edit it, but you will be able to download it. So if you will, click on one of the links. Thank you, Kristen, that Kristen and I, it's the same document. So just click one of the links. See if you can download that document. And as you're downloading that document, we're going to give you the opportunity to go into a breakout room. And you're going to go into the breakout room for about 10 minutes. So Kristen, I'm going to call a little audible there. We're going to go 10 minutes in the breakout room. And what I'd like for you to do in the breakout room is think about, take a few seconds to review the document. And I will, I'm going to stop sharing here so that I can pull up the document and give you just a quick.
Oh, you got it. Okay.
Quick view of the document there. So you're going to be thinking about a goal. So as a group, identify one communication goal. And so we want you to be really specific here. So your communication goal might be to find stakeholders to engage in the underage drinking task force in the county. So we want you to be very specific about your goal. And then who's your avatar? So one of the avatars for the underage drinking task force recruitment might be the district attorney. So my district attorney is a 62-year-old male who is a father, who is a career professional, who is politically engaged in the community and reads the newspaper. So what information or call to action do you need that individual to know? And then what's the timing? When and how often will you deliver the communication? And what's the best channel or method of communication? And what tools and platforms will you use? So think about in your group a goal, and then identify as many avatars as you can in the time that we have. But what we'd like for you to do is just be very mindful about this process, because this process is what's important for you to take forward so that your coalition will be successful in your planning. Any questions before we go into this breakout? And Leonard put a conversation or a message in the chat. If you can't download the document, please email Leonard at lcjordan@wakehealth.edu and he will email you that document. Hearing no questions, Kristen, we're ready to go.
All right, I just started them. You should find them under participants, the little tab, and everyone's been assigned a room. So just go ahead and move into your room. And I'm going to broadcast to everybody the link again. Okay. So there are a lot of people who haven't moved into their group. So Leonard and Stephanie, if you want to just go, and I think there's some people who have just stepped away and they're not joining their group, but it looks like every group has at least 4.
Okay.
Yeah, I will.
You want to do the odds and Leonard do the evens?
Sure.
That works.
Great idea.
All right.
Versus those that are in band, or I mean that you know, those that aren't in extracurricular activities versus those that are in band or sports or whatever. You know, what if you want to reach a larger audience, include them all? Then that becomes your avatar.
So you would have multiple avatars, and that's exactly the point. The point
Okay.
is, if we're going to reach people, in session 1 focused all around this concept is that we have 2 seconds to capture somebody's attention in our media messaging. And if we don't capture them specifically based on what they care about, we've lost them. And so we have to package our communications for the band students. We have to package our communications for the high achieving academic students, for the choral students, for the student athletes. And so if we can sit down and come up with 7 Instagram posts that specifically identify what those individual students care about, they feel like we're talking directly to them, and we're going to have a higher return on our investment in making sure that they receive the message that we're giving them. So that's why we have this concept of identifying the avatars and being very specific in engaging those avatars.
Thank you. That really helps. And in other words, there has to be more than one plan for each of these avatars. And I didn't do the first 2 communication training, so I guess maybe I missed out a lot by not doing that. Thank you.
They're recorded, so Kristen and or Leonard will pop how to access those in the chat box. And that way, if anybody missed those, you all can catch up. But just thinking about having a wide variety of stakeholders or avatars, whatever we want to call them, gives us the opportunity to be very strategic in our messaging. And that's the point, is we've been pretty non-specific in the past. And so the idea here is to give us the opportunity to be very specific in our messaging as it relates to people in our population of focus. And so I'm going to go ahead and bring our conversation to a close because I acknowledge the time, and just want to identify that we've talked about the interpersonal and group communication techniques today and how we can plan for effective communication across our strategic plans. and then how we can be very specific in our communication planning. So I'm going to go ahead and stop things here and turn it over to Kristen, who I know has an evaluation for you. Kristen?
Yes, I put the link. There's a couple links in the chat, but I will tell you when you close out, it's going to say, hey, you're going to an external site, and it'll automatically send you to the evaluation. And when you're done completing it, do put your comments in, because we read them and we share them with the presenters, and we use your feedback to build even better. So when you're done, pause. Don't close it out automatically like I always do, because the certificate of attendance, which I know everyone's really interested in, it downloads automatically up in your little download icon, usually in the top of the screen, sometimes the bottom of the bar. And that you can personalize it with your name and save it on your computer. Make sure you go to our website, pttcnetwork.org/southeast, and you'll see all of our upcoming trainings. Make sure you register for those. And thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and participating in the breakout rooms. A lot of people flee right when they see breakout. So I really appreciate all of you staying and sharing your wisdom with one another and practicing. I'll make sure that you get the link to that Google Doc if you didn't get it already, so you can kind of work through that. And if you're not sure what on earth is an avatar, I put a link to session 1 in the chat. I also put a link to just our YouTube channel. So you have to kind of mine through and you'll find Workforce Development Session 1 and Session 2 and all the other things that we've done as well. And you can, Leonard shared his email. You can always just email us at the Southeast PTTC and we will follow up with you. And I think that is my big, huge download. So on the East Coast here, it's 12:30. Make sure you get something to eat. Drink lots of water today. If you can, get outside, get some fresh air, and take care of yourselves. And we'll be seeing you really soon. Be safe, everybody.
Bye, everyone.